5th December, 1883. The red door in my basement is slowly appearing other places in my house. I know this is difficult to believe. I hardly believe it myself. But sure as the sun rises and rivers run to the sea, the door is not staying in the basement where it belongs. My name is Leslie James Fletcher. I'm 33 years old and live alone in a manse outside of London. I inherited the house from my parents when they died. It was a boating accident 3 years ago, and I was their only son. I've been living in the company of our old caretaker, but last year he died as well. Since then I have been living alone in this house, and I have preoccupied myself, often late into sleepless nights, by exploring every nook and cranny of it. That was how I discovered the red door, although I did not think much of it at the time. It was around 3 in the morning, as near as I can guess, around 3 weeks ago. It was a frigid, windy night, and the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the old house was making sleep impossible. I rose from my bed and wrapped myself tightly in my dressing gown. The fire had burned low and the house was dark and chill. Barefoot, the floorboards cold and creaking beneath my feet, I lit a bedside candle and ventured forth into the close darkness of the house. I had recently, on another sleepless night, explored the attic, and decided therefore to take the opposite direction. As I shuffled through the near darkness, shielding my candle from gusts of icy wind that knifed through the smallest cracks in the walls, I felt a slight apprehension steal over me. Perhaps it was the weather, or the creak and moan of the house around me, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention like soldiers. The thought crossed my mind that perhaps I should return to bed, attempt to coax sleep to me once more. I discarded the thought, however, on the principle that the method had never worked before. If it was to be a sleepless night, there was little I could do to change the fact. I made my way downstairs, each stair letting out a muffled complaint as it took my weight. It took me some minutes to reach the basement, and it was with a fair amount of relief that I closed the heavy oaken door behind me, quieting the howling of the wind. Although the basement was cold, the air within was still, the darkness complete. It was a welcome relief from the noisy commotion without. In the small sphere of my candle's light, I could see that the basement was a low-ceilinged room, held in place by thick timbers and brick walls. I spent some minutes exploring the clutter, chests, boxes, books, shelves, but found little more than faded antiquities. At the far end of the basement, however, there was a door. Its knob was brass, its red paint cracked and peeling. I tried the knob. It rattled when I turned it, but the door was locked fast. I tugged, hard, but the door would not budge from its frame. Hot wax dripped onto my hand, loosened from the candle by my exertions. Cursing under my breath, I gave up my struggle against the door and moved on, continuing to sort through the trifles of lives past. I occupied myself in this way until dawn, when fatigue at last overcame me and I shuffled gratefully to bed. This first encounter with the basement door was of little note. I resolved, at some point in that long sojourn in darkness, to discover if any of my keys would fit the door's lock. It was several days, however, before I recalled my resolution and entered the basement to fulfill it. It was, I believe, November 12th, when I brought my keys to the basement with me. I had little else to do that evening, as the roads were choked with snow and travel was therefore impossible. Once again I brought along a candle for illumination, for there were no gas lamps in the basement, nor any source of natural lighting. I had collected several keys whose purpose was unknown to me, ones I had found lying around the house in drawers or on counters. When I brought them to the door, however, none of them fit. They were all much too large. The keyhole in the door, I discovered, was minuscule, like one for a chest of drawers or a jewelry box. Upon my discovery, I went on a further expedition through the house to collect all the keys I could find, anything that looked as though it might fit a lock. I scooped into my pockets and ferried to the basement. Not one of them came close to fitting the door. I examined the keyhole in detail, but the illumination from my candle did not allow for fine observation, and I could not make out much. I burned my face a bit, in fact, holding the candle ever closer in an attempt to uncover the door's secrets. At this point I declared my enterprise fruitless and abandoned it. Thoughts of the door did not trouble me overmuch throughout the following week. Occasionally I would think on it, wondering if perhaps I could pry it open with a crowbar or some such. On the whole, though, these were passing thoughts and were quickly forgotten. The 1st of December, however, brought with it more than just snow and ice. As I passed the door to my basement, I noticed something amiss. In its alcove, the door was different than I had remembered. I drew closer and recognized peeling red paint, a brass knob with a tiny keyhole beneath. At the time I thought I must have been dreaming, for when I rubbed my eyes and looked again, the door was as it had always been. Thick oak, iron handle, strong iron bolt. Shaking my head, I put the matter from my mind as best as I was able, writing it off as exhaustion, perhaps a waking dream. The same phenomenon occurred the next day, however, and the next. When I looked askance at the basement door, it took on the appearance of the red door. When I turned my full attention to it, it became itself once again. 2 days ago, the third consecutive day of this occurrence, I entered the basement, candle in hand, to confirm that the red door was in its place. It stood innocuously on the far wall of the basement, half hidden behind piles of clutter. When I shut the basement door, it was purely out of instinct that I drew the bolt. Yesterday, when I approached the basement door, I noticed nothing amiss. Thinking the episode over with, I continued my day as normal. I went to my fencing lesson, procured groceries from town, and returned home late. As I prepared for bed, however, I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the red door lurking in my hallway. When I turned to face it, it vanished without a trace. Unnerved, I locked my own door that night, and slept uneasily. I have been keeping closer watch on the doors in this house since. I have discovered that any door in my house at any time may take on the appearance of the red door, only to resume its normal facade when confronted. The entrance to my basement, however, has remained securely bolted. I shudder to think what might happen should I unlock that door, and yet I am besieged by curiosity about what lies beyond. I do not know what to do. All I know for certain is that there is something amiss, and it hinges upon that red door. 12 December, 1883. For the past week I have been plagued by fleeting images of the red door. I do not know how much longer I can withstand this onslaught. At first I had wondered if merely my sleep-deprived mind had been playing tricks on me. It would not be the first time such a thing had occurred. However, the prolonged and unceasing appearance of the red door has convinced me otherwise. Just today, as I stood outside the West Hall entryway, the third door on the left, one of the guest bedrooms, took on the appearance of the red door for a full 3 seconds as I stared directly at it. When I blinked, however, the door changed back to its unassuming wooden facade. I have redoubled my search for the key to the red door. I will not venture into that basement without it. The thought has occurred to me that I might open the door by other means, brute force or lock-picking, but something stays my hand. The thought of opening that door fills me with dread, for what sort of foul things might lurk beyond such an ominous portal? No, I have decided that I must open the door with key, lest I disturb whatever lies in the darkness beyond it. With increased exploration of the house, however, I have opened myself to further opportunities of encountering the red door. It is, quite simply, everywhere. The only limitation to its ubiquity seems to be the grounds of my parents' manse. I have never encountered it in town. Perhaps it would be wise to spend the week-end there, to allow myself a respite from the relentless appearances of the red door. Yes, I have decided I shall depart this house until Monday, and spend the interim with Mr. Brewer, an old friend of my father's. Perhaps he shall have some insight into the matter. 16th December, 1883. My weekend with Mr. Brewer has been decidedly a heartening experience. Although I did not immediately tell him my reasons for spending a few days in town, he welcomed me in with avuncular hospitality. Over a few glasses of an excellent port, we discussed my family's finances. Mr. Brewer is an accountant, our respective healths and prospects, and, at last, the state of my parents' estate. "Well," I began, "I don't quite know where to begin."
"My dear boy!"
Mr. Brewer exclaimed.
"Is there something wrong?"
Wrong? No, I replied. At least, not entirely. Perhaps. I don't know. It's been a very confusing few weeks.
Well, well, you'd best tell me all about it then, Mr. Brewer puffed, refilling my port. Come, let's have it.
I told Mr. Brewer of the red door, its continued appearances throughout the house. He listened in silence, nodding his head slowly every so often, the firelight flickering off of his half-closed eyes. So you see, I concluded, I must get away from it, or at least find out what the cause is.
It sounds to me, Mr. Brewer said at last, that this is perhaps a case of a troubled mind.
A troubled mind? I cried. Do forgive my plain speaking, Mr. Brewer, but I am as well in my wits as any man.
No, there's no doubt about that, my boy. I do beg your pardon, I meant no offence.
He sipped his port, staring into the fire.
Do you believe in the supernatural, Leslie?
I scoffed. Of course not. It's all mumbo-jumbo, jiggery-pokery, and hocus-pocus.
Couldn't have put it better myself, Mr. Brewer chuckled. Very well, since the supernatural is out of the picture, we must develop an alternative theory about the appearance of this door. Tell me, Leslie, have you been sleeping well?
Not at all, I admitted. Even before the door began migrating out of the basement, I was finding myself unable to sleep 2 nights out of 10.
And now?
Mr. Brewer inquired. Even less, I said. As you can imagine, the incidents have rather disturbed me.
Quite, he agreed. Well, it's my experience that a mind deprived of sleep is capable of producing strange and, may I say, occasionally disturbing hallucinations. You're welcome to stay as long as you please, Leslie, provided you go to a doctor in the morning and get a hold of something to help you sleep. For tonight the port should suffice, what?
He raised his glass to me, smiling. Thank you, Mr. Brewer, I replied, feeling a sort of weight lift from my shoulders. Despite my claim to Mr. Brewer, I'd never had much truck with supernaturalists. The incidents with the door were certainly weighing heavily on my mind, and I can't say a suspicion of paranormal activity never occurred to me. I slept well that night, courtesy of the port, and awoke in the morning, if not refreshed, then at least well rested. As per Mr. Brewer's request, in the morning I sought out my family's doctor, a man by the name of Gint. I had a devil of a time catching a cab, and by the time I arrived, Dr. Gint, it seemed, was out to lunch. I told the receptionist I would wait for him, and settled into a waiting-room chair, nursing a fierce headache that had sprung up at the first touch of the sun's light. It was a little under an hour later that Dr. Gint returned from his luncheon, and he said he would see me at once. He was a corpulent, garrulous man, red of face and white of hair, who wore small spectacles on his large nose and a shining white suit on his large body. He ushered me into his office, closed the door, and settled his bulk into a groaning leather chair. I sat across from him, at his insistence, in a markedly less comfortable chair.
Well, Leslie, I must say I was not expecting to see you any time soon, he began. How have you been? Let me see, the last time we saw each other was,
The funeral, I put in, though not for very long.
Ah, yes, sad occasion. How have you been getting on without old Seamus?
Well enough, I answered, save one small issue. I seem to be unable to sleep properly in that house. Something about the size of it, or the poor insulation.
I see.
Dr. Gint took down a small note.
What sort of problems have you been having? Inability to fall asleep? Stay asleep?
Rather a bit of both, I said, though more often now it's that I can't seem to fall asleep.
Well, that is a bit of a problem, Dr. Gint commented. I think I have just the thing for you. Wait here a moment, would you, Leslie? I'll be back in a tick.
He left his small office, closing the door behind him. I took the opportunity to examine my surroundings. I knew very little of Dr. Gint, save what I had gleaned from his interactions with my father. His office was small, but not claustrophobic, more cozy than anything. A cheery fire burned in the grate. His walls were packed with books of all sizes, mostly medical journals, from what I could make out. A phrenology model and an artistic rendering of the human skeleton adorned his mahogany desk. Against the right-hand wall was an old grandfather clock, ticking out seconds with infinite patience. I checked it against my pocket watch and found I had forgotten to wind mine that morning. As I was doing so, Dr. Gint returned.
"Here we are," he said,
handing me a small brown bottle full of small white tablets.
"Chloral hydrate. Powerful stuff, so be sparing. Just had it sent in. They say it works a treat. Take one in a glass of water, or, if you're feeling particularly sleepless, a bit of wine just before bed. Should put you right to sleep."
"Thank you, Doctor," I replied, pocketing the bottle. "How much do I owe you?" He waved a hand dismissively.
"From an old family friend? Wouldn't dream of it. Well worth my time to talk to someone coherent for once. The clinic's been full of crackpots and vagrants all week."
"Oh?" said I.
"Yes. Half of them believing they're dying, and the other half spouting nonsense about the second coming or some such. Why, I even had one gentleman in here, and I use that term loosely, mind you, said some sort of horror was lurking below the city, waiting to burst up and devour us all."
He snorted.
"I ask you, have you ever heard such nonsense in all your life?"
I cracked a smile, shaking my head. In comparison with such obvious madness, my own predicament seemed inconsequential. "Thank you for the tablets, Doctor."
"Oh, my pleasure. Do come back and visit sometime, Leslie. We'll have lunch."
I thanked the doctor once more and took my leave. Outside, the sun had been hidden by thick clouds, for which I must admit I was rather grateful, as it dulled the pain of my headache. I breathed deeply the biting air, letting out my breath in a puff of steam. For whatever reason, Dr. Gint's tale of the madman stuck with me. Some horror lurking below the city. I shook myself, wondering when I had become so susceptible as to be bothered by the ineffectual chatter of a madman. I pushed the thought away and went on with my day, returning to Mr. Brewer's around 5 for dinner. The rest of the weekend passed pleasantly enough, and without incident. I returned home this morning, feeling much better, especially since I had not needed to use Dr. Gint's chloral hydrate the entire weekend. Something about Mr. Brewer's guest room, or perhaps his port, was decidedly soporific. I can feel the sleeplessness coming upon me tonight, however, so I shall trust in modern medicine and mix the doctor's concoction as prescribed. It is my fervent hope that this will all soon be behind me, and soon afterwards forgotten.